Late on in my career, actually 5 years after retirement, I wrote a little paper called A History of McAnthro, and it was not for a heavyweight journal. It was more or less an internal thing. But I think it showed up in one of the newsletters of the Canadian Anthropology Society, and that gives me a lead-in. I was one of the founding members of what was then the Canadian Ethnology Society. And this was a result of the work of really one person's initiative, Sally Weaver, who felt that anthropology had come of age, that Canadians needed to have an anthropology society, so we weren't just all bundling off to the American Anthropological Association meetings and so on. So she announced a caucus at the Canadian Sociology and Anthropology Association, and I went along. And there were maybe 10 of us, I guess, at that, and we agreed that we should just found one. And so Bernard Saladin d'Anglour at Laval volunteered to host our first meeting, and we decided to have it during the Winter Carnival because we could get a better turnout. And we thought we would invite the linguists and the archaeologists and the physical anthropologists, and they all said no. We want our own association. It was sort of in the wind, having your own association. Okay? So it was the Canadian Ethnology Society for some time until it got politically more mature and adroit, I guess. But initially it was the idea was to have what we call a community of scholars, just to get together, share our ideas, talk, converse, encourage each other, and so on. Our first president was Roger Fautier, who was sort of a non-president. He didn't come to the meetings. He didn't even cash his travel expenses when he did come. And I think he had been put up because they figured his career needed something to help him along. But politician he was not. Nice fellow. I knew him a bit. He spent some time at Nemaska, the town that's 80 miles inland from Waskaganish, and told me why it is that you should be eating your salad after the rest of the meal, because the salad dressing oil spoils your appreciation of the food. But Adrian Tanner, who had also been in the restaurant league for a while, told me later on that you gave it to the people before the meal because it keeps the pigs quiet while you're preparing their meal. And so, anyway, that's a little aside. The second president was Sally Weaver. We went with Roger because we thought, well, it'd be politic if we have a francophone first. And then when that didn't work too well, we were looking for somebody else. And Sal was the natural person because really we owed the existence of the association to her. And then we should go to a francophone and alternate in that way. And so we had representatives from University of Montreal and Laval, and I've forgotten which one they were from, but they were very keen intellectuals. And they said, you know, you really shouldn't worry too much about having a francophone. We don't know of anybody who would be available. Why don't you just go for another anglophone? So I was the third president. And by that time we had to have a constitution, and that required that we have a past president for our constitution, and a president-elect and a treasurer and so on, all the stuff that goes with having a charitable corporation. And we had a good group there, and it continued to be a good group. It still is, although I don't go now. It's mainly that I don't travel that much, and I don't feel the need of getting my paper written at the last minute so that I can have it ready to give somewhere. And I've got enough anyway to look after. But I think that that was a success. I think that the Canadian Archaeological Association's been a success. The linguistics folks, I'm not sure, but I'm sure they're doing well. Archaeology's very well. But we are kind of specialized, and that happened at McMaster University's Department of Anthropology as well, so that we had to have sort of quotas. If we're going to have so many cultural people, we should have so many archaeologists and linguists. Well, just one linguist. Some of my best friends are linguists. However, some of my worst friends were linguists. I have to digress back to my MA thesis defense, which was the Sapir paper that enjoyed success afterwards. My enemy, the linguist, was part of the examining committee. He could have killed me on linguistics, but he didn't know that I was minoring in linguistics. And when John Honigman passed the form around for everybody to sign, he looked at it and looked at me, stunned, and said, "You're minoring in linguistics?" And I guess so. He had to sign it at that point. They'd all voted. Ha ha! Well, anyway. And he couldn't get anywhere trying to go after what I said about Sapir. I knew a lot more about that than he did. Okay. Well, what are the most important points? I wouldn't say the applied is the most important point, because I think I wouldn't have known what I was doing if I hadn't had that background. The stories, and then the more contemporary cultural situation, knowing what was going on in the past, knowing what's going on now, what of the past might be of value now. People were saying it's time to let the past go, we've got enough on our plates, and so on. Well, that's true for a while, and then people begin to look for why it was that they reacted that way, and so on. So it's hard to choose, and I'd say that it's an ideal combination. I think going along with Mike Ash, who you may interview too at some point, in his presentation when he got the Applied Anthropology Medal, he said, you can find a place to stand. You know, depending on your temperament, your experience, your situation, it may be quite activist, it may not, but you can find a place to stand. There is a place where you can be an applied anthropologist, and I agree entirely. I think you have to be aware of what the need is and what the needs are not, and what is welcome and what is not, and so on. So I don't have a particular area there. I've told you a little bit about how I wound up going to Waskaganish in 1963. And the reception was fine, but not intelligible to me. We flew in a old Norseman aircraft with floats on it, and we were with Father Bergeron, the priest, the oblate priest at the time, and with a young high school graduate, Eddie Diamond, coming home for the summer. And the priest was carrying a letter from Maud Watt, the widow of a Hudson's Bay manager of some fame, instructing the people living in this little shack that we were renting from Maud that we were government people and they had to get out immediately. I didn't know that the place was occupied when we agreed to rent it. She said, "Oh, I've got a place." And she was living in Moose Factory, and so Anyway, Aunt Eddie got off the plane to discover that his older brother was marrying Eddie's girlfriend, and he was going to be best man, and he didn't know. So we were part of a three-ring circus there in a way. But the thing that struck me immediately was that there was a crowd that turned out, and nobody smiled. And it was a little disconcerting. They didn't look unfriendly. They just didn't have a look. And one of my first papers, it only took me 12 years to complete, was on reticence. I learned why people are reticent when people come in. They don't know what they're getting. They're kind of non-committal. They'll wait and see. It's very enjoyable to watch whoever is coming in deal with this. It's like a Rorschach test. You know, people that are quite secure in themselves will be okay. People who aren't will react either with insincere friendliness or a little alarm or something like that. One guy almost stepped off the pontoon into the water and then marched up through the crowd with a flat face. And Willie, the fellow that was my interpreter and manager, said, "Well, Dick, there's your replacement." And I said, "Did I look that green when I came in?" "Yep." So anyway, going down to see the plane come in is actually kind of entertaining. And it's not just a roster. That's no longer true. Now they have an airstrip. There's lots of aircraft. People don't bother to turn out. And if they do, they don't have to be that reticent and so on. But at that time, it was three days a week. If the weather was good, you get a plane in. So that was the initiation. And there was a bit of a scramble there. Nature of Things film. I'll put in a plug for that. 1976 was when the film was released. It was filmed in, I think, 74. And CBC at that time had a Nature of Things that was not David Suzuki. It was before he sort of took that on. And it was just a nature kind of film. And they had recruited a guy, a graduate student, to be an advisor there, graduate student in anthropology, who went with them to OMNG, or Paint Hills as it was then called, and made the mistake of taking some drugs, which he shared with some of the teenagers, and the chief came to the film crew and said, "Take that guy out of here and don't bring him back." So they needed a guy to come in his place. They recruited me. The director was a young fellow, early career, Diederik de Eile, whose fascination was with Bergman films, Ingmar Bergman. Fairly stark, and a fairly stark vista. Scandinavian, not too many people, not too many anything, lots of vista. And Diederik loved birds. We had a lot of footage of birds, which we didn't use. But he also had a real gift and real sensitivity for what he was about. He had found somebody to be his manager, Walter Huboy. And Walter had, interestingly enough, married one of my former graduate students who went off to do research there and 2 weeks later was married to Walter. She was a feminist until she was married to Walter, at which point she was plucking geese and pulling the feathers off her fingertips and was being mentored by Walter's aunt, Big Mary, very well. Big Mary ran her interference and mentored her in. Anyway, Walter was our manager, and we had a sound man, we had a photographer whose name may come to me, with his Aeroflex camera. And he could go into a teepee, Michwap. People were making food and so on. And there might be 6 or 10 people in the Michwap. He'd go in there with this big Aeroflex, and it didn't bother anybody. He could film them, and people just went about what they were doing because they could tell from the way he acted that he wasn't self-conscious, and he knew what he was doing. If I had gone in with my 35mm camera, it would have been different, but he could do it. And Len Gilday, freelance. The sound man, freelance. I was a part of the editing of the film, and we would play the full film, a lot of which, of course, didn't make it to the 50-minute piece, and I would comment on it. And their writer was William Whitehead, whose companion in life was the fellow that wrote Not Wanted on the Voyage, and I can't think of his name now. Fairly famous Canadian writer. Anyway, a lot of my words verbatim wound up on the soundtrack, which was kind of a heady experience, like getting a medal in a way. And I liked it very much, and I still like it. I was looking for a particular scene in it the other day to get the Moose Cree folks to take a look at, because there's a shot of two men standing on the shore hoping to shoot a seal, and then the zoom pans back to some phenomenal distance of vista, and you see the land, water, the men sort of disappear. And my comment at that point when we were viewing the thing was, it's hard to imagine some things ever changing. This talks about the land. It's not owned land. It's not contested land. It's just land nobody can own. Okay, I mean, sooner or later everybody dies, right? You don't own land because the land stays. You can fiddle it with real estate, and I'll get to real estate in a minute. But there you are. And the water? Water's pretty basic. And that water was healthy water. Water below dams is not healthy water. There are problems. The fish starve, or they eat the wrong stuff, and so on. Anyway, filming was also a very nice experience. And it was nice to make contact with my former grad student again. And so on. Real estate. Claims, of course, change. First treaties, going way back now with the Europeans, were peace and friendship treaties. Okay. Later treaties were ceding the land ownership to the monarch. Doctrine of discovery, a problem that we still have, and which still shows up in court cases, which says the monarch of the explorer who discovers the land owns it. This is a little out of date. It goes back to the 1400s and a papal bull which shouldn't have made it, but here we are. Anyway, real estate. I was talking with a guy at Waskaganish, maybe the 4th or 5th summer, and maybe the 3rd. He said he'd built a new house. Indian Affairs was building houses on a quota. It was a nice house with two bedrooms, a kitchen, and a larger living room, and then a very small room which was for a toilet. And of course, nobody had toilets or plumbing, so it was a storage room. And so he said, "Did you see my new house?" "Yeah, nice house." "The priest said he'd give me $75 for the old one, but I thought it was worth more than that. I thought it was worth $100. That was an offer. "Oh, yeah," I said, I think it's worth $100. I don't have $100 now myself, but by Christmas time I would certainly want to buy it if nobody else wants it. That was my offer. And he said, "I don't think anybody else will want it." And that was his acceptance. I'd just bought a house. It didn't mean that I really owned it. He didn't take things away that were in the loft, a lot of stuff. he did take the door off the outhouse, which was unkind of him because plywood was in short supply. And then when we were there, it was great to have. It was near John's house. It was near Anderson Jolly's place, very convenient. And I had to borrow a jack in order to get it up so the peas wouldn't roll off the plate, but otherwise it was good. A couple of windows had to be replaced and stuff. Anyway, after the 7th summer, I realized that it wasn't really good where there were houses were in short supply, so offered to give it to our neighbor who lived in a tent and had 3 kids. And Bill Jolly. Bill was married to Willie's wife. I'm getting a little bit too kinshipish now, I guess. But anyway, very nice guy, and they were living in a tent, and so I thought, well, give it to Bill. He can have it. We'll find some other accommodation for our shorter trips. When I've lost his name. The former owner of the house, Stuart Stevens, heard about that. He was not too pleased. He sent a couple of his grown daughters down to get his stuff out of the loft because Bill's dad said, well, as long as his stuff is still in the house, he can come and take it back. So I asked Stuart to get his stuff out, and he sent his daughters down, not wanting to be humiliated to do it himself. And he made a point of having it all carried up the main drag of Waskaganish so people could see. And so I commented to a couple of people, guess you saw Stuart's stuff moving, and Hannah Hester said, junk. And still, after he got the stuff out, he was not really easy with this. Gertie said I should have added a little shed on the back. If I had changed it, then it would have been mine. So I wrote to her father, the chief, and said, so what should I do? And he said, well, you bought it, it's yours. He gave me a white man answer. And so then I figured I can't really go with that, so I wrote on a letterhead, Dear Stuart, sorry to hear you're still mad about the house. Being mad is very, very bad. Okay, you don't be mad. That's bad manners. Da-da-da-da-da-da. And that was pretty much the end of it. Bill did move into the house, and they weren't bothered because there was nothing at Stewart's there anymore, and we had the letter from the chief, and so that was that. Real estate, then, and ownership doesn't necessarily have the same meaning as what we think, or as Hydro thinks, or as other developers think. Developing what for who is an interesting question to examine. But anyway, it's very important, and it's something that's constantly being challenged, negotiated, and this will continue, particularly as long as the doctrine of discovery is still there. Okay. Extended digression, for which I apologize. Yeah, Cree life has changed a good deal. At Moose Factory, a generation or maybe even 2 generations ago, parents started speaking to their kids in English because they figured that Cree was finished and they wanted their kids to be able to get a job. The result was, when I went to a curriculum workshop there, a middle-aged man spoke in tears that he had done this, and now his children could not speak to their grandparents. He felt that there was something wrong with that scene. So change, absolutely. There were then, and certainly are many now, who feel awkward in the bush. This is a bit difficult for people with a very, very long tradition of living in the bush. The bush is home. Okay? We go down into the bush, you or I, with an axe and a tent and maybe a rifle, and we would feel a bit uncomfortable. To put it mildly, we would be perhaps fearful. If it was a Cree family, they would think it's nice to be home. Okay? No longer. Just some families now have that kind of connection to the land, and it has all to do with real estate ownership and so on. So certainly modernization has come. Certainly kids in the schools there are looking at their screens. And it's a problem for teaching. You know? It's a problem for writing a history of the people in the Moose River Basin. Who's going to read a book? Well, it's going to have to go on the web. It's going to have lavish illustrations, drawings, cartoons, gimmicks of all kinds. And so we've got to make it attractive in a variety of ways, and a book too. But yeah, times have changed. The music has changed. It was Hank Williams when I went in 1963, and it ain't now. It's people that I've never heard of, but nowhere near Waskaganish, except there are rock groups there. Stan plays bass in a rock group, Midnight Shine. They play in Toronto, they play other places, okay? Modernity is there, okay? What they don't want to do is flush everything. They want to have both. And they can do that. People everywhere in the world have worked out ways of doing that.